Um, today's program is called Historical American Art, Whiteness and the Idea of the American Nation. It's the first session of the Darkwater Project's Fall 2022 Symposium. Y'all have probably noticed you're muted, but I do have the chat window up on the right-hand side of my screen, should I need to be alerted to any disasters. My name is Tyler Green. I am the author of 2 books about American art. In 2018, University of California Press published my biography-ish of Carlton Watkins. And last year, Random House's Prestel imprint published Emerson's Nature and the Artists in both the United States and in Europe. My next book is, that Emerson book was motivated by one of the books on our reading list, Nell Painter's The History of White People, kind of a joining of Emerson's impact on American art to the ideas about Emerson and whiteness that Nell Painter presents in her book. My next book, which will probably be out in 2024 or so, or whenever we find a suitable cover photo of a dude standing or sitting on a rock, is called The Battle of Yosemite, the Civil War, the California Genocide, and the Invention of National Parks. Some housekeeping stuff about these sessions and how this will work over the next few weeks. These sessions will be available on YouTube, hopefully the day after each session. So sometime tomorrow morning. And then on Monday, I will be uploading the audio only of these sessions to the Modern Art Notes podcast feed. So in addition to getting each week's Man podcast, this week will feature B. Ingrid Olson, next week Rose B. Simpson. You'll be able to share the audio from this session with anybody you'd like. The link for the second sign-up chat for the session in 2 weeks is in the chat. The couple reminders about how you can contact us. The Darkwater Project's Instagram is in the chat. My email address is in the chat. If you don't have the PDF of the outline materials, gee, guess where that's going? Next week's book that we'll be considering is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. You can get it on IndieBound, link in the chat. It's available on Amazon as both a paperback for I think $13 and as a Kindle book for about $10. That link is in the chat. A reminder that for each session, we'll be welcoming 2 or 3 of you to present an artwork or artworks in the context of that week's reading, perhaps in relation to an exhibition or collection work or a book or an article on which you're working. The idea is that these will be roughly 5-minute presentations. Please email me at the email address. I think you might know where that went. Just a mega brief, like 1 or 2 sentence proposal, naming the work, the moderator, that's me. We'll select a couple of them. And of course, I would add that I'm particularly hopeful that early career scholars and share their approaches with our colleagues. A couple of thank yous before we get started. Thank you to Stephen Nelson at CASVA and Carmen Ramos at the National Gallery for suggesting this program back in the spring. Special thanks to the folks at the University of Michigan Museum of Art and at Tufts University for providing first opportunities for me to receive feedback that improved some of what you'll hear over the next hour and over the next couple months. We will be doing Q&A at the end. I do up on my screen, but if you could hold your questions until I kind of ask specifically for them a couple paragraphs before I'm done, that would be great. On with the show. This is a quick outline of where we'll be going today. I'll provide an introduction to the Darkwater Project. I'm going to talk about why white people, particularly me, have a responsibility to consider and examine these issues in our professional work. I'm going to define whiteness and introduce the field of whiteness studies. Present 4 very brief quotes from 4 American leaders that point to how whiteness is not a latter-day construction. Leaders of the United States were identifying whiteness as core to their ideas of the American nation. We'll talk about why American art has agency, and I'll be providing some examples of ideological art in the US Capitol and the work it does. I developed the Darkwater Project with my colleague, Dr. Kelly Morgan, beginning last year after she left the Indianapolis Museum of Art. Darkwater is everything. Its focus, its mission statement, its policies and procedures, all of it was co-created by Dr. Morgan and me. That extends to the outline for this colloquium and the reading list. Kelly provided fantastically valuable thoughts on many parts of the sessions you'll hear today and over the next couple months. After we got started on Darkwater, Kelly accepted a position creating the curatorial practice program at Tufts University, which is very exciting. It's an anti-racist focused program. And so she left Darkwater to focus building that program. Darkwater remains as a nonprofit. There's an advisory board, small one. It will grow in time in response to feedback, mostly from museum directors. Instead of having a large, complicated advisory board, Darkwater will be building individual advisory panels for specific projects. Directors told me, made a lot of sense to me, that this would be a good way of pushing knowledge from outside and from across the art historical field into institutions and into staff across institutions. And that's a big focus. Building a community of practice is a big focus of what Darkwater is going to do. Speaking of Darkwater's work, Darkwater investigates historical American art and how American art produced from roughly 1770 through the bicoastal Harlem Renaissance. I'm a native Californian, hence the word bicoastal. Played an important role in making whiteness central to American citizenship. As we go along here, I'll present the ideas of many historians about how culture, including art, has been pivotal in that way. Some of the field, today we're going to talk about whiteness studies. Over the course of these sessions, we're going to talk about whiteness studies. But there are a number of related fields that come into the work Darkwater does. The field of genocide studies, the closely related field of citizenship studies. Those of you who've kept up on those fields over the years will probably notice a few phrases as we go along. Darkwater's goals are pretty straightforward: to build, enable, and participate a community of practice among historians, curators, educators, artists, anyone working to author an American art history. The idea is to do that work both within the field and across institutions, be that in the academy or in museums, and when possible to do that work in public, whether that's in exhibition form, in media form, to take knowledge to the broadest possible public when and where we can. Dr. Morgan and I identified 5 program areas in which Darkwater will work. The first one may look familiar because it's what we're doing now. Education, continuing education, and leadership development. Darkwater is co-hosted with the University of Michigan Museum of Art and Tufts University 2 symposia this past spring. We'll be doing things like working with universities to present grad seminars, offering institutions to work with their senior leadership and their board around these issues in ways that may or may not lead to projects. Research-driven exhibitions, we have about a half-dozen exhibition projects in various stages of discussion and development around the country. Collections research and presentation is probably pretty clear. We hope to work with major foundations in the field and have indeed already talked with quite a number of them. to develop research programs that make materials available that will aid anti-racist investigations into historical American art. Finally, publishing and media, because we are all media these days, aren't we? I mean, maybe me more than anybody. Just a note about publishing and media, because the foundations that principally support the field of American art are less engaged on that side of the field than they are in exhibitions. The funding of the American field is substantially constructed around the promotion and celebration of American art, and to support institutions like museums that extend that promotion and celebration. And at a time when America is going through a simultaneously tentative and certainly overdue reckoning, I think that construct needs to be reconsidered. It needs to be broadened to include anti-racist investigation of American art's role in the construction of the United States. And I hope that happens, hope to participate in that happening in the years ahead. So let's transition into the work itself, into understanding what whiteness is and what whiteness studies is. I want to start not with definitions, we'll get there, but with the question, the imperative really, of white responsibility. A year or two ago, when I started thinking about how to migrate the historical work I'd been doing out of books and into broader engagements like this, I reached out to a couple dozen museum directors from all over the country and to senior Americanists in the museum and academic and foundation to talk with them about how to advance whiteness-centered addresses of American art. And about 3/4 of the people with whom I talked all said the same thing to me, that I was making a mistake, that to work on white supremacy, to work on the construction of race, to work on racism, that you have to be from a targeted group. And no one I talked to said to me, only Black or Asian people can do this work. But in telling me that this work could not be done by a white person, that was 100% what they were telling me. In too many art museum C-suites and boardrooms, a bizarre insistence has taken hold that white people cannot and should not conduct anti-racist investigations. In other fields, as we'll see over the course of today's presentation, especially in academic history, people constructed into whiteness, interrogating their privilege and revealing how it was constructed and enforced is routine. Within the humanities, the art museum sector stands out for discouraging and often disallowing white people from investigations of the systems from which they benefit. This alarming and accelerating trend is a new and convenient conservatism, a way for administrators to seem progressive by acknowledging the centrality of racism to American legal, political, and cultural systems, while still blocking investigation into it. Oh, by the way, as you all know, the historical Americanist field in both the museums and in the academy is overwhelmingly white. As long as directors and other leaders invent reasons to not conduct and present anti-racist investigations, they are choosing to allow racist constructions and systems to continue to flourish. So let's talk about why this is work white people must do and why white people in leadership positions must encourage and expect other white people to do this work. It's this simple. White people constructed themselves into whiteness over several hundred years, and white people built the invention of whiteness into white supremacy. As a way of explaining that, as a way of explaining why I feel personal responsibility for addressing systemic white supremacy, I'm going to kick off this colloquium by telling you about my family history, a history that details how my life was enabled by my family's contribution to and its benefiting from the construction of whiteness. There we go. This examination of my family's past, about which I hadn't really thought or honestly cared until writing my first book, has informed my prioritization of this work. And I'll start with my great-great-grandfather on my father's side. This is Lawrence, rather a good-looking chap. I met him while working on my book on Carlton Watkins. You know, one funny thing about him being a good-looking chap, when my father found this photograph before I had seen it, how good-looking William H. was. And then when I saw the photograph, I saw that my father's a dead ringer for William H. Lawrence and the subject of my first book, Carlton Watkins, were friends for about 20 years and were eventually business partners too. Lawrence moved west from Utica, New York to California in the winter of 1859 and 1860 His first job was on a dairy farm just north of San Francisco on Point Reyes, which is now a National Park Service site. Point Reyes is unceded Coast Miwok land. Euro-Americans extended the California genocide there sometime between late 1849 and 1851. So Lawrence got his start in the West on land that whites took in the California genocide. From Point Reyes, William H. moved to the San Francisco Peninsula to work for the Spring Valley Water Works, company which, thanks in part to Lawrence's management, would become one of the most powerful, most profitable, and wealthiest corporations in the 19th and early 20th century West. Spring Valley got its water from San Mateo County, which is this area down here, unceded Ohlone land, specifically Ramaytush land. My old ancestor designed and, well, he didn't design them, he constructed these reservoirs here. So by the time Lawrence and Spring Valley had expanded their operations into San Mateo County, the impacts of Spanish imperialism had devastated the Ohlone there. One of the dams that William H. constructed and one of the lakes was Pilarcitos Lake and Pilarcitos Reservoir, which I think is this one right here. Carlton Watkins and William H. met on that project. Spring Valley hired Watkins to make pictures of it. After 1868, Lawrence built a chunk of his wealth from investments in mining stock. One of the mines that helped make him rich was in the Sierra foothills. The conduct of the California genocide was especially intense in the Sierra mining districts. Lawrence almost certainly benefited from the California genocide a second time. In the 1870s, Lawrence met Alfred F. Greene, a Republican Party power broker who had served in the state assembly and who ran a huge cattle ranch on the San Francisco Peninsula. The ranch, so this house was right about here where the red dot is. The cattle ranch was up around here. And then after leaving, well, actually, I guess while he was still a cattle rancher and while Alfred F. Greene was a county supervisor, he supervised the construction of this, the Crystal Springs Reservoir, which Carlton Watkins photographed in 1875. That reservoir is still there remarkably, even though it was not reinforced. It survived both the 1906 and 1989 earthquakes. The other old ancestor did a heck of a job. When Alfred Greene was a state assemblyman in the California State Assembly in 1863 and 64, he voted in favor of bills that would sell bonds so that the state of California could pay the vigilante squads and vaguely formalized militia members that attacked, killed, and confined Native Americans across the state, which is to say that Greene helped fund the California genocide. Greene, like Lawrence, built wealth and power from land open to him, sorry about that, by the depredations committed by the Spanish and then from the California genocide. The marriage of their children created my father's side of the. In 1907, William H.'s son and Alfred F.'s daughter bought a home in Burlingame, California, where I grew up. In fact, I grew up in that very house. While the records are long lost, it's very likely that the home was built on a lot and in a neighborhood governed by a racial covenant. The typical covenant language used at the time and in this place restricted selling property within the area to people who were, quote, of the Ethiopian or Mongolian race. So let's switch over to my mother's side of the family. I can go back only as far as my mother's mother, my grandmother. Her name was Beatrice Wessel. She was an Irish immigrant who came to the United States as a child in the early 20th century. In the generation or two, or really maybe three, before she arrived, Irish were held outside whiteness, denied full citizenship in ways both political and civic. And by civic, I mean ways such as by being denied labor union membership. By the time my grandmother arrived in the US, that was substantially in the past. She benefited from the decades-long process by which American citizenship was eventually fully granted to Irish Americans. As an adult, she was a ferocious racist. About 15 or 20 years ago, when helping her to do work around the house, I found the materials of some of the groups to which she'd given money, lots of it over the years. Alas, I don't remember their names today, but I remember looking them up when I got back to my hotel and seeing that the Southern Poverty Law Center either listed them as hate groups or as having funder, board, and staff relationships with hate groups. I've never known my grandmother's unmarried name, nor the year of her birth. After starting her American life in Seattle, and while still quite young, She moved to the San Francisco Peninsula, probably to flee an alcoholic father. In California, she met and had a daughter with a man who was drafted to fight in World War II. He was killed serving his country. My grandmother never told us his name. To support herself, my grandmother opened a children's clothing store in what is now Millbrae. Here's Millbrae, a suburb adjacent to the San Francisco airport, which is here. That part of the peninsula, from roughly San Francisco, from Millbrae up to the city, was home to significant populations of Japanese Americans, men and women who were quite often small business owners, in part because Anglos would not hire them. One reason that Anglos would not hire them was because of San Mateo County sundown laws. In 1942, the federal government illegally and forcibly interned thousands of Japanese Americans in concentration camps. The Tan Fran Assembly Center, which you see here, was 2.5 miles from my grandmother's shop. The shop prospered, especially during the post-war baby boom. She was able to build her business because the internment of Japanese Americans quite literally eliminated. Sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, my grandmother met a man named Paul Wessel. I didn't know him well, he died when I was 10. He was the manager of the local Bank of America branch. Paul and Beatrice married and bought a home in Burlingame subdivision, the last infill development in Burlingame. I've been unable to confirm this through research. It's funny how a lot of these seem to exist anymore. But Ray Park was almost certainly redlined into whiteness. When legal scholar Patricia J. Williams wrote that racism is aspiration as well as condemnation, she may as well have been writing about my Irish-American grandmother. To borrow a phrase from Joan Didion, which if you've read either of my books, you know I do a lot, this is where I was from. I was born into culturally and politically constructed privilege. My family's wealth and prominence, when it had both, was built from violence, laws, and often illegal governmental actions that were racializing, bigoted, and that were designed to build whiteness and enforce white supremacy. My family's active participation in the construction of whiteness and in people from continued until at least a decade or so ago. My family's story, my story, is not exceptional. So I probably talked too long about whiteness without defining it. So let's define whiteness in the field of whiteness studies. That Americans might consider whiteness core to the American project was first proposed in 1853 by Frederick Douglass in a speech in New York. Douglass detailed how Irish, upon coming to the United States, quickly learned that they could gain civic and political rights by, quote his words, hating and despising the Negro, and that by so doing, they could join the privileges of whiteness. Douglass was probably both being accurate in terms of 1853, but he was also prophetic. A decade later, for example, a New York City mob, substantially Irish, burned down New York City's colored orphans asylum, in many ways an act of violence that argued for Irish participation on a certain side of the American binary. The Darkwater Project takes its name from the other key instigator of the field. In a 1910 essay modified and expanded for this book in 1920, W.E.B. Du Bois built on Douglass's idea by proposing the examination of, quote, personal whiteness and how it motivated the United States' idea of itself. The writings of Douglass and Du Bois are really the basis for the entire American side of the So as we go through some definitions of whiteness, I thought I'd start with Wikipedia. It's not maximally coherent. It's not even full of complete sentences, but I share it because it reveals how the field is unfolding, that investigations are ongoing, understandings are possible, and that we have the opportunity to contribute to them. I'm also fond of Peter Kolchin's definition, which is from one of this week's readings, and you may recognize this passage from the sign-up email. To be sure, the historiography Kolchin lays out in the rest of the essay is a bit limited, even for 2002. He dates the beginning of the whiteness studies field to the late 90s, maybe the early aughts. But significant US published books on the construction of whiteness go back to the mid-1970s. Kolchin writes that the authors of books on whiteness often suggest that it is an American-only construction, which I think they do not do, and it is resolutely not an American-only construction. There are significant communities of whiteness studies scholars in both Australia and Europe. And in fact, really, the construction of whiteness is sometimes considered the first transatlantic intellectual discourse in which Americans participated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And Colchin also repeatedly discusses or suggests that the books in his essay feature, quote, an over-reliance on whiteness in explaining the American past. I don't think they do that. We'll get to a slide here in a moment of a bunch of books in the field, and I think literally all of them focus on considering whiteness as being part of a constellation of impacts. The broadest definition of whiteness, and maybe my favorite, comes from political scientist and legal historian Rogers Smith in his landmark book, Civic Ideals. He defines it as the means by which a global minority has constructed itself in order to extend power and control over the majority. I like this one because it points to how the construction of whiteness was a multi-century and transatlantic project, but also because it points to how whiteness was constructed in key places in the United States. To flesh that out a bit, to give just one example from my own work that points to how a minority was roused to violently control a majority. John C. Fremont instigated the California genocide outside what is now Redding, California in 1846, at a time when both American citizens, of course, California was Mexican in 1846, and people constructed into whiteness were by far the minority within the far west in California. In 1846, people constructed into whiteness were probably a minority within Mexican California by a factor of somewhere between 10 and 50 to 1. Think about the antebellum demographics of states such as Georgia and South Carolina and the systems that were constructed and indeed that persist there. Another thing I like about Smith's book is that it does a great job of showing how important culture is within political constructions. Smith is a constitutional scholar, a legal scholar. He very often minds judicial decisions and legal arguments in building his 751, something like that, page book. And in so doing, he over and over again notes how lawyers and judges underscored how legislators and legal arguments pointed to culture as within their arguments. And I think as we go on over the next 6 sessions, that'll come up again and again. Beginning in the 19th, as I said a moment ago, substantially motivated by the American bicentennial, an investigative field began to coalesce around the nexus of whiteness and citizenship. Here are 10 of the key books in the field. I don't know how to put a number on how many books there are in the field. In the United States alone, probably 10 times this many, let alone journal articles and the rest. Note that this work is sometimes academic and is often for general audiences. Walter Johnson's book on the history of the St. Louis area is particularly intended for general audiences. So too Tyler Stovall's book, so too Nell Painter's book, so too, anyway, you get the idea. All of these historians tend to define whiteness just differently enough to be different. And I'll share examples from this colloquium's suggested readings in just a moment. To date, I count only one book that has applied these inquiries to historical American art, Martin Berger's 2005 Sight Unseen, University of California Press, which indeed includes a chapter on Carlton Watkins, but which is mostly about other forms of visual culture, especially film. Just a few months ago, an Australian historian named Jared Hoare recently updated much of Berger's address in his book, Visions of Nature, which also has a chapter on Carlton Watkins. I can do this for days. While many university museums have presented teaching gallery presentations on the construction of whiteness, the first significant museum exhibition to emerge from the discipline is up now at the Met and is on view through March of 2023. I highly, highly recommend the catalog for that show, which includes major work from curators Elise Nelson and Wendy Walters, and also from others, including Adrian Childs and the great University of Maryland, Baltimore County art historian James Smalls. I think it's important to note here that there isn't a single way for academics and museums to do anti-racist work, even though I'm focusing on whiteness studies here. But it is important to note that any strategy that relies entirely on contemporary artists to do all the work of addressing our past and present, and I think this is the dominant approach across the art museum field, one from which I'm glad this exhibition dissented, is problematic, and for lots of reasons. If people have questions about that, we can talk about it in the Q&A. So let's get to the definitions from each of our 5 books. First up, Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, the book we're reading for our session in 2 weeks. For Morrison, whiteness is the default around which American cultural production has centered itself. Across 91 pages, it's short. The book was written to be her Massey lectures, which were delivered in the same year it was published. Across 91 pages, Morrison asks whether we blindly, numbly acquiesce to that centering or whether we will interrogate it. As Camera Dia Holloway put it in the 3rd of this week's readings, quote, when it comes to art, this would entail seeing and discussing Euro-Americans as racial subjects and considering how concepts of blackness, present or not in the visual field, were necessary for the construction of an American subject. Critical race art history perceives images as a visual form of power. When we talk about Playing in the Dark in a couple weeks, I will take a stab at migrating Morrison's approach into mid to late 19th century landscape art. Nell Irvin Painter, who some of you surely know as the artist Nell Painter, and who is showing work right now at Time and Space in Hudson, New York, link in the chat, uses the word whiteness 87 times in the history of white people, which was a best-selling book, by the way. But she never defines it. Painter is a field leading, I mean, she's retired from working as an academic and she's retired from historical work to work as an artist. She's past president of the Organization of American Historians, but she always resists academic writing and academic language, which is inspiring and awesome. Her refusal to define whiteness says, at least to me, you white people know what whiteness is. You live within the privileges you and your ancestors have constructed for yourselves. I'll present an argument for how it happened, but you should know what it is. When we discuss this book in about a month, I'll particularly look at how it discusses beauty and how Americans helped culturally construct beauty around whiteness. Reginald Horseman wrote Race and Manifest Destiny, the granddaddy of these books, in the mid to late 1970s, just as whiteness studies was coalescing as a field. It was first published, the book was, in 1981. Instead of using the word whiteness, he uses the word racialism and details how Anglo-Saxonism, a framing that dominated WASP America's understanding of the United States in the century between Emerson, detailed in Dr. Painter's book, and say Henry Cabot Lodge, a century later, was constructed into racial identity. When we talk about Horseman's book, we will talk about the white American embrace of civilization and how Americans understood it to have reached its American ultimate at Yosemite. And we will also meet the pseudoscientist Samuel George Morton and consider how whites made portraits of Native Americans of the 1830s and a little bit earlier were really important to him. Matthew Fry Jacobson. He uses whiteness in his title and notes how whiteness became the Caucasian race, as do really all the others here. Jacobson notes that, quote, to become Caucasian is to reify a monolithic whiteness, and further, to cordon that whiteness off from other racial groupings along lines that are silently presumed to be more genuine. Jacobson builds from sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant, who note that the contending, quote, forces of class formation and racial formation in American political culture produced the institutionalization of a racial order that drew a color line around rather than within Europe. Remember that phrase, we'll come back to it. When we talk about this book, we'll talk about the Monument Lab National Monument Audit, which was published last year and which makes super clear how monuments were a part of constructing whiteness. One other thing on Jacobson, he points to 3 key periods in the development of whiteness. First, the congressional passage of the first United States naturalization law in 1790, a law which limits naturalized American citizenship to, quote, free white persons, and which thus determines that whiteness is key to self-government and America's hope to perpetuate it. Jacobson's second period starts in around 1840 with mass European immigration to the United States, first Irish, then others. And his third period begins in the 1920s during the Second Klan era when Caucasian, quote, became codified in state and federal laws, the legalizing conclusion of previous generations, Slavs and Hebrews and Saracens becoming white and American. Last book is the most recent one to be published. Yeah, that's right. Tyler Stovall's White Freedom, a book that might be said to have sprung from a phrase that recurs in Nell Irvin Painter's The History of White People, Painter's observation that the American tradition equates whiteness with freedom while consigning blackness to slavery. Stovall, who passed away earlier this year, was a scholar of French liberty movements and of the transatlantic construction of freedom. He uses the word whiteness 85 times in barely more than 300 pages. He defines it several times within the book, but let's use this one. Whiteness is, quote, a social and political rather than biological category. The dominance in racially segmented societies is as much achieved as given. It was actively done. When we talk about Stovall, a couple of the artworks I will talk about are William Wetmore Story's two great Civil War era sculptures, Cleopatra and the Libyan Sibyl. Not going to go on to provide a complete and thorough political and legal history of the construction of whiteness here or in any of these sessions. It was not done one way. It was done through the politics. It was done through politics, the courts, fiction, poetry, pseudoscience, labor movements, often illegal state police actions, as we've already discussed, and plenty more, including with art. Any narrative, any single narrative of the construction of whiteness is a windy road. The recommended readings will give you a good start down it. But at the outset, it might be useful to spotlight how key figures in the founding and development of the United States offered their own definitions of the American project at key moments in the American project. You'll see that white nationalism was at the core of their definitions. Consider this evidence that whiteness isn't a construction of latter-day historians or to definitions of the American project since instigation. We'll start with Ben Franklin, who included this passage at the very end of his essay, Observations Concerning the Increase of Mankind. Franklin wrote it in 1751, disseminated it through correspondence with colleagues and friends on both sides of the Atlantic, and finally published it in 1755 and then repeatedly afterward. It trafficked widely in transatlantic intellectual circles. Adam Smith cited it in Wealth of Nations, and scholars have quite often argued that the pamphlet informed Charles Darwin's work. After the American Revolution, after thousands of Black Americans fought for the revolutionary cause, Franklin came to be quite embarrassed by this paragraph, and in his subsequent publication of the essay, removed this paragraph. Thomas Jefferson, he devoted extensive passage outlining perceived Black and indeed Native inferiority across his 1784 Notes on the State of Virginia, which was published in Europe, not here, of course. And then he migrated these ideas into this law that he helped write when he was the governor of Virginia. This is a time, the late 18th century, when citizenship was defined by states, individual states, or commonwealths, as the case may be. It would not be until the 20th century that we would get to where we are now, where we understand the federal government as determining citizenship with things like our passports. Stephen Douglas, in 1858, and Abraham Lincoln instigated the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates over the course of 2 days in Chicago, Illinois. They each delivered an oration with the other in attendance, and then headed out on a barnstorming tour of Illinois. This was Douglas's marker for what America was. And he and Lincoln debated this very point across famous debates. In the 20th century, the construction of whiteness was often somewhat more layered than this. Take the World War I period, for example, the Second Klan era I mentioned a moment ago. Senator James Vardaman of Mississippi warned that Black soldiers had been, quote, ruined by French women, and that these ruined Black soldiers constituted a threat to American women and girls. President Woodrow Wilson said that, quote, the American Negro returning from abroad would be our greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America. In other words, Blackness was the enemy of Americanness, which to the notoriously racist Wilson was equated with whiteness. We see echoes of this construct in today's politics a lot. That same year, Wilson said this, 1919, a record number of Black men were lynched in the United States. And across the Red Summer of 1919, white mobs invaded Black neighborhoods to pillage and kill, instigating several years, or maybe continuing in the case of East St. Louis, several years of white on Black violence, in which the Tulsa Black Wall Street Massacre is the most notorious. Oh, by the way, at a time when 10% of Americans were Black, 13% of Americans who served in World War I were Black. So a 30% overrepresentation. As Tyler Stovall notes in White Freedom, this Black overrepresentation seems to have motivated whites to reassert their priority. So let's begin to transition toward art and its role in the construction of whiteness. And before we talk about some pictures in a specific place, the US Capitol, I want to make clear what Darkwater's project is. And to discuss that, I want to raise the great Wanda Corn's lecture and essay from the readings. She wrote it in 1988 as an assessment of the historical American field. I think looking at it today, we can consider it kind of a halfway marker between the instigation of the historical American field and the present. Across the essay, Corn both celebrates the young field's progress and points to opportunities for its development. And indeed, in many ways, she was a seer. More than once, she complains about the over-closeness of, quote, the intimate ties between American art scholarship and the art market, and how that closeness has effectively forced investigations into American art into a certain ideological safety, one that maximizes potential commercial success. The other reason I wanted to spotlight Corn's essay is because she particularly looks askance at two practices that have continued in the 34 years since she wrote this lecture and essay. First, she bemoans that works of art, quote, works of art become illustrations of changes in social history. And the history, because it is told around pictures, tends to be overly simplified and incomplete. Absolutely. I join Corn in rejecting that construct, most often presented in exhibition form, in which art is used to merely illustrate a history presented as being uninformed by that art as kind of the equivalent of pictures in a children's book. This is a practice that reflects both a lack of respect for art's engagement with and role within a culture and polity. It is a practice that denies artists intellectual agency. It is a practice that says that America, an example, is merely pretty pictures of nature and logical, and indeed quite often mindfully and often purposefully ideal. Next, Corn disapproves of the practice, be it authorial or curatorial, of taking modern intellectual understandings and applying them to historical art. In addressing a certain generation of white male historians and curators, Corn says they presume that historians read the past guided by their own needs and values, and that history writing is no less an imaginative creation than the work of the art itself. Furthermore, the meaning of the work of art is not fixed at the time of its making, but changes over time. The job of critic, the term they use to describe themselves, and in Corn's essay, she goes out of her way repeatedly to know what she's talking about is a white man, is not to try and recover the past as if it were immutable, so much as it is to read the work anew, to reanimate the painting by a close reading of its structure and content through the lens of a late 20th century sensibility. And I want to emphasize that this is not what Darkwater is doing. Across these presentations, I will not be applying a modern philosophical or theoretical construct to the past. Instead, I will try to build from the work of dozens of historians in revealing how artists participated in and contributed to the intellectual and political cultures of their time. And it is in that context, within the context of the art's making and presentation, that we will discuss their work. To be clear, Darkwater was constructed with the understanding that art and artworks have impacted the United States, that art has helped inform the idea of the American nation that is the United States. Across many humanities disciplines, the study of poetry or fiction or philosophy, scholars have routinely argued for the role their discipline or their area of study played in our national construction. I think we should too. All right, let's talk about smart. Let's look at 4 artworks in the US Capitol, starting with the 2 roughly 6-foot by 10 and 11-foot paintings that Albert Bierstadt made for the House of Representatives chamber in the mid-1870s. While most and maybe all of the scant scholarship on these works has focused on the price Bierstadt hoped to realize for them, the ideology Bierstadt engaged and extended with them reveals how they helped build and inform post-Civil War white America's idea of itself. Here's the other painting. These images are likely, very likely, scans from very old color transparencies. So far as I know, these pictures have not been photographed since around the 1980s, maybe earlier. And to be honest, I'm not even sure where in the house these pictures are now. I think that they're in stairwells on the house side of the Capitol, but due to construction and HVAC and things like that, that may not be presently correct. Which is to say the ability to see sunlight and shadow that is so key to Bierstadt's work, and not just this work, is going to be muted by these slides. It's the best I can do. Bierstadt painted this conceptual pair, hoping that the House would buy and hang them in the House chamber on either side of the Speaker's platform, and it did. They hung there from about 1806 until 1901, and here we see how. So these are 2 stereographs, each taken from different sides of the house. So you can see the California painting over here, and you can see the Hudson painting here. It's impossible in these stereos to see the 2 other paintings hanging next to the Speaker's chair. One is a portrait of George Washington, and the other is of the Marquis de Lafayette. More on them in a minute. These are entrance into or arrival paintings, fictitious scenes of European arrivals in North America. The leading American painter of such scenes was Bierstadt's friend and mentor, Emanuel Leutze. Indeed, Bierstadt knew that one of Leutz's entrance into pictures, this one, was already in the Capitol. This is 1862's Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, which is painted proof that George Berkeley, at least to Leutze, was painted proof that George Berkeley had correctly foretold the white North American advance of European so-called civilization across the North American continent. Note the bottom, the Golden Gate. Bierstadt wanted his own arrival pictures in the US Capitol too. So let's take a quick look at how Bierstadt composed the California half of the picture. Entrance into Monterey Bay is dominated by a giant oak tree. It is a version of an oak tree that Bierstadt painted over and over and over again in his California paintings of the 1870s, perhaps most notably in a painting of El Capitan at the Toledo Museum that we'll see in a few weeks, and in this great, roughly concurrent California spring at the DeYoung. It's really interesting to me that the large Central American elms in paintings of the American East from the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, references to the Liberty Tree of Boston Common, are Bierstadt with California oaks. And it's telling us something with that. Bierstadt certainly is nothing if not a literalist. Bierstadt imagines the Spanish and Catholic arrival in California via Monterey Bay as taking place in the early 1870s. Early 1770s. As you're surely thinking, it would take another hour to detail the ways in which nearly everything in this painting is preposterously false, so I'm not going to do it. Just know that it is. So far as we know, Bierstadt never visited this area. The tree, of course, is his own invention, and the land he paints here is likely adapted from this Carleton Watkins picture, one of a series of dozens of pictures of the Spanish colonial missions that Watkins made in the mid to late 1870s. So notice the hill in the background, the fall of the land, flattening of the middle ground before it falls off again, In a way, the Watkins picture reveals, and perhaps indeed suggested to Bierstadt, what he would do in the 2 house paintings. So note the Carmel Mission in the center of Watkins' picture, which is of course a Catholic church. Bierstadt eliminates it and instead paints of what he offers up as the Catholic arrival in the far west. Note that he paints Costanoan Ohlone people as bowing before the introduction of Catholic Christianity into the far west. Note the lambs in the foreground and the cattle. European religious visual iconography meets American expansionist and imperial visual iconography. This is a picture of Catholic arrival, of Christian triumph in the far west. Note, too, that Bierstadt stages his scene in front of a setting sun. This is Bierstadt shouting back to the 1862 Leutze we saw a moment ago, and also to a few other things I'll discuss in session 4. Remember Leutze's title, though, the one taken from George Berkeley's 1726 Verses on the Prospect of Planting Arts and Learning in America. The stanza went like this: "Westward the course of empire takes its way, the first 4 acts already past. A 5th shall close the drama with the day," hence our sunsets. "Time's noblest offspring is the last." Bierstadt's other house painting, and I'll do this one a lot more quickly, is of the Dutch and Protestant arrival in Eastern North America. Hung together as Bierstadt intended and as they were installed for about 30 plus years, they tell lawmakers and their constituents a national origin story. The United States is of European descent. It is a Christian nation of providential construction. Today's United States, Bierstadt shows, was settled in the far west by Catholics and in the east by Protestants. The union of the 1860s has given way to a renewed nation. Here is a new union, Catholic and Protestant. Natives are explicitly othered and marginalized. In one picture, they are being pushed pictures far left hand side by Europeans who are about to move in that same direction, east to west, right to left, across the continent. And in the other, in the California painting, of course, with nowhere left or west for Native people to be forced by white Americans, they will be subjected to America's most horrific and extended genocide. Note that there is no room for Black or Asian people, and of course remember that the Chinese exclusion era is underway in the far west in 1876, in either picture or narrative. Remember that for most white Americans, the United States was a white nation for Bierstadt also. Let's talk for a moment about Bierstadt's construction and address, and perhaps his installation in the House chamber is important, about how the art we've been looking at has participated in the construction of whiteness and also citizenship. Remember that citizenship is a civic, political, legal, and cultural construction. Rogers Smith describes citizenship laws, quote, as responses crafted by political elites to meet 2 basic political imperatives. First, aspirants to power require a population to lead that imagines itself to be a people. And second, they need a people that imagines itself in ways that make leadership by those aspirants, the people in that house, appropriate. These needs drive political leaders to offer civic ideologies or myths of civic identity that foster the requisite sense of peoplehood. Artists helped with that. And to support citizenship laws that express those ideologies symbolically while legally incorporating and empowering the leader's likely constituents. Speaking of constituents, here they are. American art has been a crucial method by which civic ideologies and or myths of civic identity have been built. Sometimes art's impact on the American nation is direct, cause and effect, as with Carlton Watkins at Yosemite. Sometimes it is a key instigator in a broader project, such as in George Catlin's paintings of Black Hawk and his band, or in the way American landscape painting develops in concert with and as a participant in American settler colonialism and genocide, as what genocide scholars would call the imposition of a new national pattern on a subjugated people and their land. In time, we'll get there, not today. Whomever it was that designed the installation of Bierstadt's pictures in the House chamber understood all this. The intentionality in this installation would make the most conscientious modern-day curator proud. Again, over here we have Spanish, California, the West, Washington, Lafayette, Dutch, New York. This is Constantine Brumidi's fresco of Washington at Yorktown, which was moved into a house restaurant in the 1940s. So note that we have here Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant. Washington was an Anglican. Let's think about why this was important in the mid-1870s, in the decade after the Civil War, after massive white division, and what was at the moment Bierstadt was painting and perhaps installing these pictures, a terrifically strained attempt at reunion and reconstruction. 1876, the year Bierstadt seems to have completed this one, the California picture, was the year that Reconstruction ended as part of a corrupt bargain that resulted in Rutherford Hayes being elected president. Over the previous generation, immigration had massively changed the United States. Immigrants from Catholic countries such as Ireland and Poland had streamed into the Protestant United States by the millions at a time when there were about 38 million Americans. Emanuel Leutze made a painting that's what was called the Maryland Historical Society of Catholic interest in Maryland, for entrance into Maryland, for example. By the time Bierstadt made these pictures, 2.5 million Irish Catholics had already come to the United States. There were also German Catholics, especially in the Midwest, and Poles and Slavs had begun to pour into the country also by the millions. Bierstadt's pictures and the house presentation of them are thus a construction of whiteness. These new people coming to the United States were Christian, and thus they belonged as American citizens. Remember Matthew Fry Jacobson's framing that I mentioned earlier. The construction of whiteness, of belonging, of legal, political, social, and cultural privilege in the United States was, quote, the institutionalization of a racial order that drew a color line around rather than within Europe. And that's beginning of when that racialized order was being recreated, the precise moment Protestants and Catholics are joining in union to expand whiteness. It is in these years that Bierstadt's semi-diptych is on view, that the highest percentage of the US population was foreign-born. Catholic immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, especially Poland and Italy, and also from Ireland, pushed the percentage of the US population Catholic from below 5% before and during the Civil War to nearly 20% by the time these pictures are moved elsewhere in the house in the early 1900s. Again, of course, there are no similar concurrent paintings in the Capitol welcoming Black Americans into American citizenship, into what Nell Painter and Tyler Stovall call white freedom. At least a generation before Bierstadt made his pictures for the house as the Capitol was being built and then more or less finished, artists were commissioned to contribute to the idea of the American nation in ways that the still young nation hoped would be its most hallowed and representative sites. So let's look at where legislators, members of the Supreme Court, and the general public would themselves have started entering the Capitol until quite recently. The Capitol's east entrance, the one facing the Supreme Court. This thing here in the foreground is the newish Capitol Visitor Center, which is now where people enter. But until the construction of this visitor center, you entered through these doors here. These doors were modeled on Lorenzo Ghiberti's Florence Baptistry doors, and they were made by Randolph Rogers. They weigh about 20 pounds. They're never going anywhere. I'm sorry, 20 tons. They're never going anywhere. The work is known as the Columbus doors because they depict scenes from Columbus's life and his so-called discovery of America. So let's zoom in on one of the panels on one of the doors. This one shows a sailor in Columbus's employ forcibly subduing a woman of indeterminate and obviously to Rogers unimportant nativeness. Rogers shows her with unkempt hair, as primitive and topless. We may be watching the prelude to a rape. The scene extends and normalizes the notion that Americans not culturally or politically constructed into whiteness needed to be subdued and overrun. This, Rogers, is one of many works in the Capitol to present Christian and white nationalism as the idea of the American nation. Rogers' doors work as part of a cultural political feedback loop by which ideas are made into laws. They reinforce and give permission for the extension of then present practice. It's important to note that Rogers' doors weren't visible only to visitors to the US Capitol. They were widely distributed across the United States through the most popular photographic media of the day, or medium of the day, the stereograph. If you go to darn near any library in America with a stereograph collection, you'll find these. Rogers' construct entered the popular consciousness and helped tell white Americans who they were. who was American. Note that this is Horatio Greeno's infamous sculpture of George Washington. Rogers' doors are there. Rogers' doors and stereograph. And a stereograph of the panel we just discussed. Ooh, that's a little blurry. Sorry about that. Upon arriving at Rogers' doors at the east entrance down here, a visitor would walk through the Capitol's main lobby, which is still there, and into the Capitol Rotunda, which is too. A few feet to the left hung this canvas, and indeed hangs this canvas, Virginia painter John Gadsby Chapman's 1840 Baptism of Pocahontas. Note that Chapman made this picture 10 years after the passage of the Indian Removal Act and 8 years after the Black Hawk War. By 1840 standards, a painting welcoming Indigenous Americans to Christianity, and thus a certain, albeit quite limited, Americanness, would have been considered the celebration and promotion of a moderate position. After all, Chapman did not represent the violent, what really happened, the violent expulsion of natives from their land, as had been taking place across North America for 200 years. Instead, Chapman celebrated a mythologized cultural acquiescence, a native person's purported acceptance of European American dominance, and of course, the potential for such to continue. As art historian Vivian Green-Fried noted in her excellent 1992 book, Art and Empire, which is about selected art in the US Capitol, Chapman's picture argues, falsely, that native dispossession was a product of cultural and religious suasion rather than physical violence. Not only has Chapman's picture hung in the rotunda since 1840, its reach was enormously extended both by stereograph, but also when it was placed on the verso of our first national paper currency. Here's an example. And while we're looking at cool old money, now is a good time if you have questions to start posting them in the chat. So this Chapman is a picture that helps construct whiteness. Let's place the picture in the context of its own time. In 1827, so 13 years before it's made, as momentum for Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act grew, or really was born, in the state of Georgia, the leading newspaper in Georgia's capital, the Southern Recorder, said the loud part out loud, quote, "Abstractly, there is no difference between indigenous and Black people." Americans expanded the definition of whiteness across the 19th and 20th centuries, but the legal and political construction of people of color always included Native Americans as being of color, and thus beyond the legal privileges and protections American routinely granted to men considered to be white. As the Southern Recorder made plain, the bigotry that motivated these ideas, not individual or specific, instead it was a binary, who was white and who was not. The message of Chapman's picture was, and is, unambiguous. Whites may celebrate welcoming non-whites into Christianity, but not more. Isn't it interesting that in a painting made for the building in which the United States wrote, passed, and until 1935, adjudicated its laws, that Chapman's picture is of religious welcoming, and not the inclusion of the picture's subjects into the rights of citizenship that were and are constructed in that very building. Speaking of which, these artworks are still there, still in the US Capitol. We have not reckoned with the appropriateness of having this art in that place. The fictions Albert Bierstadt and John Gadsby Chapman painted and that Randolph Rogers sculpted stand in place. Lawmakers have walked past them every day for 180 years. The ideology and faux history that Bierstadt and Chapman and Rogers created, invented, have held. That's power. Is it any wonder that ideologies that were fundamental to our past have become crucial to our present? So that's what I've got. If y'all have questions, I would be happy to answer them. And so far, we don't have any in the chat. So if you have a question, there's a pretty good chance it's going to get answered. Or a challenge, question or a challenge.
Tyler, can I just speak? This is Andrew.
I'm not sure. Can people hear Andrew? Yes, they can. Okay. Yes, Andrew, you may speak.
Just to really, I mean, thank you very much. That was a bravo entry into the subject matter. Could you extend that narrative outside of the specific historical and political agency to the construction of even an American art canon over the period of time? Because I see this recapitulated throughout the 20th century in collecting practices and exhibition design, or exhibition choice, where these now resurface narratives that show alternative understanding, don't really make it to the public forum.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely could and should be done. I mean, you can really continue all of these ideas right up to the present day. I think that when Dr. Morgan and I were deciding what dark water would be and what it would be focused on, our thought was that World War II and forward is pretty well covered. That institutions are pretty aggressive about using contemporary art, particularly artists who are alive and making new work to address the past. And that wasn't a need for us to include it within Darkwater's work. I think concurrently, we found that the museum field in particular was dramatically under investigating art of the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries for its contributions to the construction of white supremacy in the United States. And that there was an opportunity for an independent project outside the academy, outside the museums, to take that on and to try to build a community of practice around broader investigations. So yes, and that. Adrian Childs is,
yeah.
There we go. Fire away. I'm obviously not very good at unmuting.
Thank you very much for this. It's wonderful. And I'm trying to formulate a question, but it's something that's striking me about the Bierstadt images and the notion that of constructing whiteness, but looking back at a time probably in the 17th or 18th century when Europeans are coming here, they're competing against each other. There are Italians, there's Portuguese, there's Dutch, there's Spanish, and I don't know that they're thinking along the same terms, in the same way of whiteness as they would have been in the 19th century when these paintings are, because they're competing against each other to dominate this new land, and they're thinking about themselves in religious ways or in as nations. So how does that all get reconciled?
You mean earlier in the 18th and very early 19th century?
Yeah, because what they're depicting is a time when they're not thinking of I don't think they're thinking of quote unquote whiteness in the same way they are in the 19th century when they're not looking back on this and trying to construct a narrative. They're taking these different factions that are coming to the new world, and there's a very different impetus. They're still coming to take over and to dominate, but it just seems to coalesce in different ways when they later.
Matthew Fry Jacobson's book gets into this a lot. And so we'll talk a lot about that in I think it's the 5th session. But that's true. As immigrants come here, they come with a set of allegiances, often first to church or at least to a specific faith. And Jacobson's book details how they join the American project. We'll look, for example, at one of the fascinating things about the audit, the National Monument audit that Paul Farber and his team released at the end of last year, was I think they determined that a Polish general from the Revolutionary War is the subject of the 5th most public monuments in the United States. And those monuments were all erected before the full privileges of political citizenship, the vote, were extended to Poles. So we see people coming from specific places, constructing narratives that argue for their place within the United States project, even before they are granted that place within the United States project, and they're using art to do it, making or commissioning or agitating for in front of city councils. There's a question in the chat. What do I make of Colchin's critique that whiteness studies often conflate race and class as categories similar when they are in fact quite different? And the questioner asks, because in my own autobiography, I seem to be apologizing for my white privilege. I think I'm just identifying it. That is my class position gained with the aid of my family's whiteness, as though it were synonymous with my whiteness. That's a that critique of Colchin's has been made by many whiteness scholars. And in the years after Colchin was writing in 2002, many have made that critique central to their books. I agree they are different. I do think it's important that we understand there's a difference between recognizing and acknowledging and apologizing for. I can't do anything about what William H. and Alfred F. did. But by studying what they did, I can understand how I got to have the opportunities I came to have 100 years later. I think there are ways of addressing American art's role in the construction of whiteness that take on and separate race and class. But I haven't done them yet. I mean, I'm not proposing this colloquium as a complete story. And I hope that some of the questions this colloquium prompts motivates people toward their own investigations, and that would be a great one. I mean, I think Robert Henry would be a great subject of that investigation, perhaps. His portraits of immigrants. Jenny Perlin asks, oh, thank you to Karen Lemmy for posting the Monument Lab audit link in the chat. I highly recommend that. It's really, really interesting. It is not a document, a report that, it's trying to be indexical rather than interpretive, but probably everybody on this call will find about 10 directions in which they can run with it. Jenny Perlin asks, as an artist, I am interested in the iconography in these landscapes and the way the view is constructed. And I addressed, as she notes, I addressed that in relation to the Bierstadt and the Watkins and the directionality of the California and Hudson paintings. Can I talk a little more about the way space is constructed and imagined in those? Yeah, I can do that. Let me share again. There we go. Oh, rats, my chat window went away. Sorry, I have to read the rest of the question. Can I talk about the way space is constructed? Her current project is about views from the air, particularly balloons in the early 19th century. She's interested in the way photography and aerial viewpoints figure into these artworks. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot in the construction of this picture is note how Bierstadt pivots Watkins' picture. These lines that are the heart of the middle of Bierstadt's picture, so that he gets Monterey Bay in the picture, the entire Monterey Bay. And he has to do that because he's making an argument, he's building a narrative around arrival and entrance. And he's so worried that in his presentation of a mass here, that his audience will miss that these people, the Spanish Catholics who are holding this mass upon arriving in California. Of course, they did not arrive in Monterey on boats. They came up over land. So he has a ship here off the coast. I hope it's showing up on your screens, showing they arrived this way. The other change here that jumps out at me, and this is not only about the black and white of Watkins's picture. Any of you who've been on the Central California coast know that a heck of a lot of it, 11 months of the year, looks like this, kind of brown and short grassed and chewed over, even though it hasn't. And Bierstadt paints it as lush and green. And he needs it that way because he needs it to be the form in which American settler colonialism has moved, always signified in American history, the King Philip's War, and always signified in American art by the presence of cattle. And then, of course, the lamb's got to eat something, and they're not going to grow real old on this stuff, right? But I'm glad you brought that up. That is something I am thinking about a lot in terms of these very pictures, and I'm not done thinking about. Can take a couple more here. Actually, yeah, this is the first session. I'm willing to take more questions, and certainly, of course, won't mind if people cut out early. Erica asks, oh, that was not a question. That was just a comment. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, you know what? That may be all the questions. If anybody has anything more, this is last call for questions. Aaron Monroe in the chat pointing to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, considering these questions. Aaron knows that I was recently there sticking my finger way too close to a lot of her paintings, making overly loud and vociferous arguments about them. So yes, Wadsworth has a particularly strong collection for going on about this, for addressing this. Laura raises a question in the chat about how curators are addressing these issues in their wall texts, and I'm glad somebody brought that up. I think it's really, wall texts are important. Wall texts are really important. What we do in our texts right next to the paintings is important. But I think it's also important that we not confine our presentation of our investigations of these pictures to single paragraphs. In some ways, America's history is really complicated, and in some ways it's really not. And we're limited in what we can do in one paragraph. I think one thing that's also really important about that is art museums are public history institutions. Those of you who read Eric Gibson's unfortunate column in the Wall Street Journal this week know that people are comfortable with art museums being public history institutions when they're extending European constructs of civilization or uncritically celebrating Titian or Matisse's greatness. But we should be mindful that art museums are public history institutions far beyond celebrating and promoting ossified narratives. They are and should be sites of investigation where investigations that are longer than a paragraph are constructed and presented, narratives across a single gallery from a collection. I'd like to see more art museums devote, 1,000 to 1,500 square foot collection galleries to annual or semi-annual interrogations. And yes, I know it's easy for me to ask for more than single paragraphs when my first book was 574 pages long. Sorry about that still. We have a comment and a question about Confederate monuments being removed from public spaces, and the discourse that was sparked in response to that led to questions regarding how our current culture treats historical racism in artwork. For example, whether historically racist artworks should be destroyed, removed, and recontextualized in a different location, or simply left in place as an educational reminder of our racist past. Min was curious, as someone with a background in art history, how I would deal with these questions, particularly regarding the paintings in the US Capitol. That's a very good question. There's a whole lot on that coming up in, I think, session Yeah, session 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there. I will give a preview of that. There's a lost cause Richmond-born, Rome-based sculptor named Edward Valentine, who was one of the primary competitors for the what became the 1890 sculpture of Robert E. Lee on top of a horse that Richmond, Virginia erected outside Richmond. Valentine did not get the commission, and he was ticked off. He did get a subsequent commission for Monument Avenue, one of Jefferson Davis. Art critics liberated it from its elevated position not too long ago, and covered it with paint and spray paint. As it so happens, Richmond's oldest museum was created by Valentine and his family. It's called the Valentine House. Well, it was called the Valentine House. It may now be called the Valentine Museum. The Valentine Museum has taken that Valentine bronze and installed it in the museum as the monument was found on the ground beneath its plinth in Richmond, which is to say, fallen and defeated. And I think that is a fascinating, spectacular, immensely thoughtful, and in the context of museum practice, brave way of exhibiting a long lionized object. I do think we need, as a field, to talk about what we do with these things. One of the projects I hope to be working on in the coming years, and then indeed all of Darkwater hopes to be working on in the coming years, is the most significant, most art historically significant lost cause white supremacist sculpture still on view in a prominent American city. And so I've been thinking a lot about how to present that work in public, in exhibition form within indoor space, if you will, and how multiple things within that work need to be deconstructed. The art historical references in that work need to be interrogated and revealed, and so does the way those references operated within the lost cause, both within art that constructed and extended the lost cause, but also poetry and fiction and other forms. Art never acts alone in all this, and all we're discussing today. And very, very, very often these ideologies do not act without art, without including art within their extension. In the chat, yes, good. Thank you to Peter for sharing that. A recent issue of Panorama addressed some of these works, and Peter included a link in the chat. And it's well worth a look. Indeed, I think there is a Vivian Green-Fried essay that was a part of that Panorama package. If somebody could nod, that would help, if I'm right. Okay, I think there was. We'll see. I think we're caught up on call for questions again. I'm going to post the link one more time for sign up for the next session. This will also be going out in email and on the Darkwater socials. And look forward to seeing you all in a couple weeks when I will try really hard not to share any more Carlton Watkinses. Thanks.